flight.
The John F. Kennedy assassination still gets covered up to this day. They still spend money covering this up.
Here's the position that most critics have believed.
Most critics think Connolly was sitting directly in front of the president. Well, they're all idiots. We know from the magic bullet and from the actual vehicle that Connolly was sitting left to the president. He was in a booster seat. The car was modified. So the critics have it all wrong. You know, there are no critics. There are people that look at the evidence. There are people that know what happened. The United States government's bullshit did not happen. There's no supporting evidence. It was all fucking bullshit.
We look at it from the side here.
So what's the reality? Was Connolly sitting directly in front of the president, or was he in a booster seat to his left? Not to mention the person to his left was closer to him, right of Jackie, right? Well, let's look at history and evidence, not computer graphics.
You can take a trajectory line and you can...
So, to the left, we have a frame I took from a video. This is real history. This is the car. And there's a photograph below it. And to the right, we have a really disgusting documentary from National Geographic where I took a screenshot where they try to represent how they were seated. And then below, from that crap that we just witnessed, a screenshot from that. Now, it's so simple, anybody can do this, but it's obvious. Connolly was sitting directly in front of John F. Kennedy, and the reason why they want you to believe he was sitting left of the president in a booster seat is because they have to make this convoluted story to try to fit what the government wants you to believe. They want you to believe in the magic bullet theory. And that's why he's got to sit like that. It's all bullshit. They lie to no end. All you have to do is look at the evidence. That's all you have to do.
There was a monstrous cover-up of everything. I know it, and so do the people who covered it up.
It angers me terribly that we don't know the truth. And the arrogance of those in power that continue the cover-up and the lie is beyond tolerance.
We're not a free country anymore because the people who are smart enough and powerful enough to take out a president like that and get away with it for 25 years are probably involved in other areas of the government. In other words, the country is being run by people we did not vote for.
If it could be done to John F. Kennedy in 1963, it could be done to another president in the future. And we can't afford to have coup d'etats in America, no matter how cleverly orchestrated and sinisterly contrived they may be. That cannot be permitted to happen. And the way in which you prevent that from happening is to expose those elements of government and society in this country that were responsible for the killing of John F. Kennedy.
Well, what the situation is about, nobody has told me anything except that I'm accused of murdering a policeman. I know nothing more than that, and I do request for someone to come forward to give me a legal assistance.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about it was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, my hand here. Okay.
Visibly shaken by this news, Oswald was to be interrogated for a further 36 hours.
A policeman hit me.
Before his transfer to the county jail. Meanwhile, the Warren Commission, charged by President Johnson to find the truth, operated almost entirely in secret. Based in Washington, the commissioners finally came to Dallas. Their spokesman was former CIA Director Allen Dulles.
Are you convinced that he was shot from the school book depository?
Well, I think we better leave all that, you know, the evidence report will cover all of that, and we'll get into that, but that question might lead to a lot more, and...
Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, also came, with Commissioner Gerald Ford, a future president. The prime purpose of their visit was to interview Jack Ruby, who had appealed against his sentence. A frightened man, he claimed he could not talk freely in Dallas and begged 8 times to be taken to Washington to testify. The commissioners left, ignoring his pleas.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people that had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
Now, these people are in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
The Warren report concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, killed President Kennedy. Incarcerated in his cell overlooking Dealey Plaza for another 2.5 years, Jack Ruby suddenly contracted cancer and died at Parkland Hospital. With his silence permanently guaranteed, Ruby's body was flown to Chicago, the place of his birth, for burial. Only now, a quarter of a century after the president's death in Dallas, is the appalling truth behind his assassination and its cover-up revealed.
We had been told that the president had been shot from behind, from the Texas School Book Depository. If that had happened, he would have been thrown forward, the transfer of momentum of the bullet striking him in the rear of the head. But what we saw was the exact opposite. When he was struck, he was thrown to the rear and to the left, indicating a shot from the grassy knoll. The knowledge that we had been lied to scared me. I felt if anybody knew what I knew, that I'd be in a great deal of danger. So I didn't tell anybody. I quietly worked on the film for years. The more evidence that I was able to develop in the film, for instance, the timing of the shots, when the first shot was fired, which was a lot earlier than the Warren Commission had told us, at a point when Oswald, had he been up in that window, could not have fired the shot, until the most frightening, horrifying physical aspects, the nature of the wounds to the president's head, which are visible in some frames after the headshot, much clearer than anything the public has ever been allowed to see. Living with that became a horror. Trying to keep that, afraid of being discovered that I knew that, that's what frightened me the most.
The Warren Commission ignored the film evidence of a shot from the front. They were also selective in their choice of eyewitness testimony. The doctors at Parkland Hospital, who tended the president minutes after the assassination, also saw a head wound compatible with a shot from the front.
I could see that he had a large, about 7-centimeter opening in the right occipital-parietal area. A considerable portion of the brain was missing there, and the occipital cortex, the back portion of the brain, was lying down near the opening of the wound, and blood was trickling out.
Almost a fifth, or perhaps even a quarter, of the right back part of the head in this area here had been blasted out, along with probably most of the brain tissue in that area.
Since the autopsy, there's also been a major discrepancy in the description of the president's fatal head wound.
It would be a jagged wound that involved the half of the right side of the back of the head. My initial impression was that it probably was an exit wound, so it was a very large wound.
This is not what the official autopsy photographs show. Hidden away for a quarter of a century and shown here for the first time, they reveal the back of the head intact.
Here you can see a line really stand out. And you can do different effects to these pictures, and that's a real division line right there. It shows that they did something to the back of his head.
The autopsy photographs show a massive wound, but it's in the right temporal area and into the parietal area, which is behind it, between the two. It is inconceivable to me that every single one of the witnesses who saw the president's head could be wrong, and specifically wrong, about this particular wound. They describe an avulsed, exploded open wound in the rear of the head. In the autopsy photograph, you see a small, neat wound of entrance. It's obvious to me that those photographs have been faked.
When I first saw the pictures of the president's body, so-called wounds, what really struck me was especially the head wound. They showed a nice little neat round bullet hole in the back of his head. Well, actually what I saw was the whole side of his head blown off. It was gone. I don't know where those things came from, but they're totally wrong. Every one of them.
In 1964, the Warren Commission dealt with this evidence by not looking at it. It was made available to them. They felt if they looked at it, they would have to deal with it and publish it, so they didn't deal with it. In 1977, around that time frame, the House Assassinations Committee had the photographs. What they did with it was even less excusable. They had the photographs, they had the questions that were brought to them about the photographs, and they did not allow the Dallas doctors, the most important witnesses in this particular area of the evidence, to even view them. And the reason seems quite clear. If they have the best eyewitnesses looking at the photographs saying that's not the condition of the president's head, then you not only have a conspiracy to kill the president, but absolute proof of the conspiracy to cover it up after the fact, because the only people who had the photographs were the government. If somebody faked those photographs, it was someone within the government, someone who had access to those photographs.
But there are further disturbing indications of manipulation of the medical evidence in the hours prior to the autopsy at Bethesda. Dallas doctor Robert McClelland.
I would estimate that about 20% to 25% of the entire brain was missing.
My job in working with autopsies was to remove the brain. What struck me was when we removed the sheet, I looked down, I said, my God, he didn't have any brains left, literally. I was just astounded by it. I think everybody else was too, because there was just a gasp throughout the room. There was no brain to be removed at all.
At any normal autopsy involving such gunshot wounds, the brain would have been sectioned and the bullet tracks traced and all bullet fragments examined. This was not done. A vehement critic of the government's handling of the medical evidence is also one of the world's leading forensic pathologists, Dr. Cyril Wecht.
If the brain was not sectioned, then there could be no visualization of its interior. It's as if it never existed. I am very, very suspicious, and I do think that it could have been the height of a sinister conspiratorial activity in the post-assassination cover-up in this case to make sure that the brain was not examined in order to be able to disprove, or at least to be able to withhold the attempts by other people, me and other critics, to prove that there was a second gunman firing from the right side. Because again, you see, that gets to the question of whether or not there was a conspiracy.
Another long-standing critic of the official version of events has pursued the truth through the Freedom of Information Act, acquiring valuable documents which he believes prove a cover-up at the highest level. Former Senate investigator Harold Weisberg.
Lee Harvey Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby on Sunday, the 24th of November. Nicholas Katzenbach was the acting Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General, and he knew immediately that Oswald wasn't going to be tried. They didn't have to put this evidence into court. So he takes a lawyer's yellow Lego pad, he writes out in longhand a memorandum to Bill Moyers, that was the channel to Lyndon Johnson, and in essence he says, we got to convince the world that Oswald was a lone assassin and that the evidence was such that he would have been convicted if he'd gone to trial. This is before they collected any evidence. This was Monday morning, Monday after the assassination.
The Dallas police were still collecting evidence and had to be stopped. After Oswald's death, the FBI swiftly requisitioned all the physical evidence, much to the chagrin of Police Chief Jesse Curry.
I had a request, and I have it here, where Mr. Wade requested, said I request that you turn all of the evidence obtained in the investigation of Lee Oswald's assassination of the president over to the FBI for mailing to Washington.
Dan was summoned to meet an official from the CIA, a company man. David Vanek, a fellow officer in assassination training, also attended.
First, the company man took me aside and showed me his badge, his ID card, and he asked me if I would volunteer to kill a man, a United States citizen, a naval officer. Didn't tell me who it was at first. Now, I assumed what he was talking about was killing a man overseas. He asked me at first if I would accept an assignment to kill somebody. He didn't give me the name, but then I asked for the name, assuming it would be, like I said, overseas. And he gave me the name, William Bruce Pitzer. Hard name to forget, really, once you hear it. And so I told him yes. And then he said, well, you have to, he started to lay out the details of it. And the details included the fact that I would have to get him, before he retired, And he retired in a very short period of time, if I remember correctly, and he was stationed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, so I'd have to actually get him here in the United States. Well, I refused, because that wasn't the way that we were trained that this was going to happen. We were supposed to be used as their assets, the CIA's assets, for use in assassinations overseas. In the United States, the mafia was supposed to supply what resources they need for killing somebody here in the United States. So he then asked David Vanek. He went over to David Vanek and talked to him. Now, I don't know what he talked to David Vanek about. He might ask him the price of ice cream. I don't know. But I never saw David Vanek after that day. Now, that was in August, the first week of August of 1965.
In November 1963, William Bruce Pitzer was head of the audio-visual unit at Bethesda Naval Hospital. A close colleague at the time was a young petty officer, Dennis David.
3 or 4 days after the assassination, I walked in his office and I saw he was working on some film. He had a movie editor, one of those reel-to-reel and runs across the screen, and he showed it to me, and it was a 16-millimeter film of the autopsy. There were also some slides. He had some slides that he had that showed of tissue slides, and also showed some slides of President Kennedy that were taken while he was on the table at the morgue. And we looked at him, kind of horrified, I guess you would say, at the seriousness of the wound. But I remember one of the things that I remembered was that we saw they had a picture of Kennedy laying on the table, and it was a front profile, if you will, or front view. And the only thing we saw was a little hole about here in the temple, and then another photograph or another slide that Bill had showed a huge gaping hole here in the back. And so Bill and I logically assumed that the wound was a frontal entry wound, as opposed to what the Warren Commission later said being shot from behind.
Dennis left Bethesda for a new posting, but in November 1966, a colleague gave him some distressing news regarding his old friend Bill Pitzer. He'd been found dead in a pool of blood in his studio at Bethesda. The official verdict was suicide. Lying face down on the floor, a .38 revolver by his side, he had a bullet wound in the right temple.
When the occupational therapist had told me this, I remember I reminded said, that doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense, because Bill was left-handed, and because we used to kid him all the time when playing bridge about being a southpaw, because sometimes he'd deal in reverse instead of dealing them in the correct sequence. He'd deal them in the opposite way, and we'd kind of harass him about it.
There are grave doubts about Pitzer's alleged suicide. His left hand had been so mangled, as if tortured, that his wedding ring could not be removed and given to his widow.
Bill had told me shortly before I had left Bethesda, which was around the 7th of December of '65, he told me that he was planning on retiring because he had enough time in and he was wanting to get out, and that he also said he had some damn lucrative offers from some TV networks, and other people have asked me why I think he was assassinated, and I think it was because that with him retiring, they, and I don't know who they are, were afraid that he would take these pictures that he and I had seen, this 35 millimeter and the 16 millimeter film, that he would take them, and that if he went to work for a major studio, that they would use them, or he would have them aired, and that would really, blow some people out of the water if that would have transpired. I could be wrong, I could be all wet, but I do know those films exist because I was there, I saw the damn things.
I am absolutely certain that the name that I was given underneath those pine trees of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, the first week of August was William Bruce Pitzer. I put it completely out of my mind from 1965 until 1993. And I was watching a special in November '93 about the assassination of Kennedy. I think it was a special by Jack Anderson. And at the end of that special, on the television, they rolled a list of 42 names of people who had met a violent death that were somehow associated with the assassination or the cover-up or the autopsy or something. And I was sitting there in my living room watching that, and the name William Bruce Pitzer came over the screen. And it made me go right back to that day in August of 1965. That was the William Bruce Pitzer that I was asked to kill, unless there's two William Bruce Pitzers that worked at Bethesda Naval Hospital. That man, the name of the other Green Beret that was approached by the CIA agent in August of 1965 at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was David H. Vanek, captain, who went through the same training I did, same class I was in. And I have tried, ever since I saw the name William Bruce Pitzer come out on that screen, I've tried to find him. And I've been totally unsuccessful. I sent letters to the special office and the Retired Services Directorate, where they'll take a letter that you send them with a man's name and serial number, and they'll forward it to him. Or if he's deceased, they'll send it back to you. I got no response from them, so I finally sent another follow-up letter and demanded a response, or I threatened to go to Senator D'Amato to help me on the response. And then I did get a response, but the response was that David H. Vanek never existed in the United States Army.
But Dan still has published Army orders proving that Captain David H. Vanek was with him at the Special Warfare Center. So late in the day, the Commission were left with only 2 bullets to cause all the wounds to both Kennedy and Connolly, and one of those bullets had to have injured both men. To explain this, Arlen Specter, a counselor to the Commission, created the single bullet theory, known to critics as the magic bullet.
The infamous magic bullet. We have that bullet exiting from President Kennedy's neck, moving forward and leftward and downward. It now stops in midair, it turns to the right, it comes back a full 18 inches, stops again, and then slams into John Connolly's back. It continues downward, and it goes through his wrist, and somehow they get that right wrist over to the left thigh. If you look at the Zapruder film, you'll see in the individual frames that John Connolly's right wrist is not near John Connolly's left thigh. The significance of this, the importance, cannot be exaggerated. It is impossible to overstate it. Why? Because the single bullet theory is the sine qua non of the Warren Commission report. It's not a matter of how much weight and credibility do you give to it. It's a matter of whether or not you have a single bullet theory that permits you to conclude that there was only one person firing, whether it was Oswald or anybody else in the world. If you don't have a single bullet theory, then you cannot have a sole assassin. And if you move to that point, then you're into conspiracy by definition.
They even have mock-up models that they say are replicas of the car and how he was seated. And then they show you he was sitting left of the president. That's what they'll say, because they have to make the magic bullet theory make any kind of remote sense. So he has to sit left of the president. And to the right are a couple of bullshit documentaries. You see how they have Connolly sitting to the left? That is supposedly historical fact, and all the skeptics got it all wrong. The above one is from National Geographic. It is a disgusting documentary. It's just more of the cover-up. And if you draw lines on these people's heads, you can see this shape. The government wants you to believe he was sitting left of the president, and that there's critics of the magic bullet theory because it's all part of the cover-up. But the U.S. government wants you to believe simply did not happen. And this book, Moral Error, has some serious bullshit in it. It's so false. Anyone can see this. How does anybody fall for this nonsense? The magic bullet theory is completely made up. Shots came from the grassy knoll. The president went back into the left. The U.S. government covered up the John F. Kennedy assassination, and John F. Kennedy did not even have an actual autopsy. He had an exit wound in the back of his head that they covered up. Look at the Dallas doctors. Look at the witnesses. There's no reason to believe the U.S. government's bullshit, no matter how much time goes by. Wake the fuck up, America. You have no country. Learn about the Jesuit order. They run the fucking world governments.
After the assassination, Beverly was contacted at work by FBI agents who took her enveloped film and promised to return it within 10 days. She has not seen it since.
From the position that I was filming, I had the best shot of the assassination, and probably the only one that had a real good shot of the grassy knoll. And probably would be a lot of unanswered questions answered if my film could be found.
Fortunately, a few feet to Beverly's left, Mary Ann Moorman in the dark coat took her picture a split second after the president had been fatally struck in the head. Although frequently examined by the FBI, her historic snapshot was too widely publicized to disappear.
We know that the president's car was in the center.
Its dramatic secret, however, has only recently been uncovered. After 5 years of intensive study of the Moorman picture by two researchers in Texas, Jack White and Gary Mack, there is at last convincing evidence of a gunman up on the grassy knoll.
Here is the guy that we call Badge Man, and it appears to me that from our study of it, his waist is right at the top of the wooden fence.
Gary Mack was the first to isolate the image, now known as Badge Man.
What I was looking at, to a lot of people, might have just been like looking at an ink blot or something. And all of a sudden, I started to see eyes and ears and forehead and hair. And little by little, the pieces of this image started to make sense to me. And that's when I first called Jack. And with his photographic work doing the blow-ups, we could see more and more and more detail. And at one point, we realized that this fellow was probably wearing a police uniform, or some type of uniform that was close enough to what the Dallas police were wearing, so that he could pass as a police officer. And really, to me, that was the one scary moment, because that was such a brilliant plan. A police officer in that location, away from where people were watching, if anyone did see him, they wouldn't think anything about it, because there were police in that area, although nowhere near where we see this guy. So this guy was an imposter.
That's when I started to line up my frame so that I could take the picture of the parade. I had been panning shots through here so that I could get whatever was going to come down the street. And I saw that it was the President of the United States. And as I was panning down this direction, just as I got to about this position, a shot come right past my left ear. And that meant it would have had to have come from this direction. And that's when I fell down. And to me, it seemed like a second shot was at least fired over my head. There's a bunch of report going on in this particular area at that time. And what happened was that while I was laying on the ground, it seemed like a gentleman came from this particular direction. And I thought it was a police officer because he had a uniform of a police officer. But he didn't wear a hat, and he had dirty hands. But it didn't really matter much at that time, because with him crying like he was, and with him shaking when he had the weapon in his hand, I think I'd have gave him almost anything except the camera, because that was my mother's. And literally what the man did was kick me and asked me if I was taking a picture. I told him that I was. And when I looked at the weapon, it was about that big around, and I decided I'd let him go ahead and have the film. I gave it to him, and then he went back off in this direction. I went off in this direction. And 3 days later, I was in Alaska. And I didn't come back to the United States for about 18 months.
We spent a lot of time studying the picture and looking at little details, and I guess in the back of our minds was a story that had come out 4 years earlier by a man named Gordon Arnold, who claimed to be a witness to the assassination and claimed to have been standing up by the fence. And there was a light blob of something very close to where Badge Man was. We weren't sure what it was, but gradually, as details started coming out with Jack's photo work, we realized that this image was probably Gordon Arnold. And here's a guy who had told his story just to an acquaintance and was overheard, and that story went off to the news media, and Gordon Arnold was interviewed, and it appeared in the newspaper that he had been at the scene and was in that location, but no one believed him because there were no photographs or films that showed a man in that position. But all of a sudden, the Moorman picture confirmed his story. And again, the interesting part is that Gordon Arnold's story came out 4 years before we noticed the appearance of this figure in the Mormon photograph.
We later learned that Arnold was wearing this army cap that had a slight point at the top and a medallion on the right-hand side that said U.S. Army, and it's exactly what we see in the photograph. We also know that Gordon Arnold was filming this scene with a movie camera, and that's exactly what the photograph shows, because we see the right arm of the person in this position with his hand up toward his face and what appears to be obstructing his face, something perhaps like a movie camera.
All right, you want to check that measurement once again?
Yeah, this is about...
Gary and Jack's work has been verified and duplicated by independent experts in Great Britain. Measurements taken in Dealey Plaza and from Mary Ann's original camera confirm that it was possible for the Badgeman figure to have fired the fatal headshot.
And excellent view of the street from here. See the center lane, which is where the president was, and see that whole lane for almost the entire period. It's a great position to be in.
But the photograph had yet more to reveal.
I was sitting in my office here one day looking at the picture, and I saw just all of a sudden, what appeared to be another image standing directly behind the badge man. This appears to be a person in a hard hat and a white T-shirt. The lighting on him is entirely consistent with the lighting on badge man. In other words, there's a highlight on the construction helmet that he seemed to be wearing. There's a shadow of his head down on his shoulders, and the lighting source is absolutely consistent with the rest of the picture. He appears to be looking off in the direction of the school book depository.
It was important in all this work that we develop somehow some independent corroboration for what we were seeing. And one of the important and yet often neglected witnesses in the Kennedy case is a railroad signalman named Lee Bowers, who was working in a railroad tower behind the picket fence and behind the grassy knoll. And he had a good view of the area where we see these figures. And he testified to the Warren Commission and told them that when Kennedy appeared in Dealey Plaza, there were two men behind the fence that he could see. And these two men were in this one position the whole time before, during, and after the shooting.
Lee Bowers died in a mysterious car accident 2.5 years after the assassination. However, his story is confirmed by another eyewitness, Ed Hoffman, a deaf mute who is interviewed here for the first time.
I'd gotten off work early because I had a dentist's appointment. I was traveling down the freeway here, and I remembered that President Kennedy was coming to visit Dallas. I parked my car here. I realized at this spot that I would be able to see Kennedy pass close by. I stood here and waited, and I was looking towards where he would be coming from. I suddenly saw two men who looked suspicious directly over there in the car park.
25 years ago, these trees did not obscure the view. From his position at the side of the freeway, Ed Hoffman could clearly see the car park area behind the grassy knoll.
I saw a man standing here, wearing a black hat and a blue jacket. I saw a puff of smoke, and I thought it was a cigarette, but it wasn't. He had a gun, and he walked towards the railroad. He tossed the gun to the second man. Then he turned and straightened his jacket, adjusted his hat, and walked casually away. The man with the striped shirt, the railroad shirt, walked over to the electrical box with the gun. He took the gun apart. He put it in a toolbox. He then walked slowly away in the direction of the railroad track. When the motorcade passed by below me here, I realized that Kennedy had been shot. I was horrified. I saw a policeman standing on the railroad bridge, and I tried to get his attention, but he didn't see me. So I got in my car and drove to the area where I had seen the two men. But there were so many people there, and I couldn't find them. I went to the FBI to tell them what I had seen. They didn't want me to say anything. They offered me money to keep quiet. They didn't understand that it was more important for me to tell them what I'd seen. It was hard for me to communicate with them. I do feel that the two men I saw were working together, and that the one with the gun behind the fence was the man who shot President Kennedy.
Look at the situation. The FBI started in the investigation right away, and they had all these reports, over 50 reports from eyewitnesses saying at least one of the shots came from that area. And here, all of a sudden, they've got a photograph that shows the precise area within a sixth of a second of when the president's head explodes. Someone, somewhere in the FBI must have wondered, perhaps the gunman is in this picture. And I think they knew the evening of the assassination that there was a second gunman up on the grassy knoll. The medical evidence as it exists now does not indicate a shot from the front. But we do have to understand that if Badgeman was firing, and if it was Badgeman's shot that struck the president in the head, that means the medical evidence has been altered. And there you've got conspiracy existing within the United States government.
Despite the government, Gordon Arnold is certain of what he saw.
The training that I had just finished, they were shooting live ammunition over us. And when a bullet goes past your ear and your eardrum feels like it's coming out the other side of your head, it's close. That's why I thought I was shot. There's no doubt in my mind that I was there, and it did occur.
Further verification of Gordon's presence on the knoll comes from a surprising source, Senator Yarborough.
During that shooting, my eye was attracted to the right. I saw a movement, and I saw a man just jump about 10 feet like at the old-time flying tackle in football and land against the wall. I thought to myself, there's an infantryman who's either been shot at in combat or he's been trained thoroughly. The minute you hear firing, get under cover.
This colorized version of the Badgeman picture was shown to Gordon Arnold for the first time. He has always believed there was no proof of his presence on the knoll that day.
Looks like a soldier in summer uniform with an overseas cap on. It looks like it would have been my uniform. It looks like there's a camera. Or there's something up in front of the face. It looks like a white spot. If it's a flash, it would be like off of a muzzle flash. This looks like a police officer because that would be the badge. That would be the arm emblem. Would this fella back here be the railroad man I asked you about this morning? Because when I was walking to the site, and I had never told anybody that I had, when we were out there filming, it reminded me that there was a railroad worker just standing out there by the railroad tracks. But that, it looks like somebody's taking a picture. Yeah, I couldn't figure out why would I be standing crooked until I flipped that up, and if that's a muzzle blast or flash, then whoever's standing there would have been a fool to stand up straight. He'd been trying to get away from harm's way is what it boils down to. And that could very well be me. Son of a gun. That would be the closest thing that I've ever, to be honest with you, the picture bothers me because if this is a true thing of what has occurred, then I could be the only one that saw the man. They killed the president. And to be honest with you, if I'd have known this, I wouldn't have given the interview.
said it's too close to home right now.
A frangible bullet is one that is constructed to literally break apart upon impact. Some people call it an exploding missile, some people call it a dum-dum, but they're not quite the same. I think the more correct technical word would be a frangible bullet. If a frangible bullet had been fired from the right side, then it would have, of course, dispersed into dozens, if not hundreds, of fragments, leaving no significant piece of itself intact. There were many small pieces of metal that were never subjected to neutron activation analysis testing. And unless that was done, you see, we could never know for sure whether all of the fragments came from one particular bullet or one batch of bullets. That's the significance of the brain examination relating to whether there was a second gunman and also the possibility of whether a frangible bullet had been used by that second gunman firing from the right side.
I mean, come on. Wake up, people. Snap the fuck out of it. Wake the fuck up. You're being lied to every day. This shit is ridiculous. Start looking at evidence and stop being lied to.